Hey HDA, and welcome back to this step-by-step guide to Dyson Sphere Program. This series is intended for players that are relatively new to the game or are simply overwhelmed by the complexity, and today we will be returning to the scaling hub that we built last time and actually turn it into an interstellar mall so we can access all these items and more actually from anywhere we want in the galaxy. Now, if you're coming here straight from the previous episode, you're probably still in the process of upgrading your facility. And a good way to do this is actually doing something else in between, like, for example, making another one of these power belts. We're going to need a lot more power on this planet, so you might as well just make use of the time you need to upgrade your facility, and mostly you need in order to actually make all the belts and sorters that you need to upgrade at, and spend it useful by making, for example, one of these power belts. Now, since I know a lot of you don't like throwing things away, myself included, especially when it comes to all these old belts and sorters that we will be getting back into our inventory as we are upgrading the rest of our base, there's a little trick you can use to, well, basically optimize the things that we have. So if you put down another distributor storage unit like I have over here, you set it to the sorter or belt that you wanted to collect. You make sure it's actually set to collect as well. All you need to do is actually go into your logistics menu over here and drag this all the way to the bottom, and it says collect all, and that will automatically get them from your inventory. I do the same for the belts, and as you can see, all these bots are now grabbing them from my belts and putting them back out on the belt to be turned into Mark II and eventually Mark III sorters and belts. Now, this is not going to be a fast process, so yeah, you need to be patient and actually stay in range for this to work. But at the very least, you can rest assured that at least part of your stuff is getting recycled. And if at some point you have too much stuff in your inventory, I do recommend you just throw it out, but that's of course completely up to you. Another small tip to speed things up is actually set the storage capacity of your incoming, and I emphasize the incoming distributors, a little lower than the max. And by a little lower, I mean a lot lower. That will help you saturate your system faster, and that makes the items being spread out better than when you have it set to full capacity. The downside of this is that in the long run, you might actually want this larger buffer here in order to make sure you can quickly recuperate any buildings that you might be spending, especially if it's large quantity buildings like foundations, smelters, assemblers, etc. But generally speaking, especially early on, setting this to a lower incoming capacity will help you better balance out your system. Instead of worrying too much about how you're going to optimize the production of your mall, just let it figure itself out for now and focus on actually progressing through the game, because then basically you're doing two things at the same time. And in order to progress, we're going to need a lot more of these ILS towers. Now, you might be able to pick a couple of dozen, maybe 1 dozen, up from your home planet that should have been producing those all the time from the build from a couple of episodes ago. But it's producing them at a very low rate, so we'll definitely want to bump that up. And in order to do that, we're going to build them here. And in order to be able to do that, we are going to need titanium alloy as well as particle containers. And of course, making sure we have some of that production going on this planet, all we need to do is copy the supermagnetic ring layout and putting in the particle containers with different inputs and making a very similar layout twice. At least I recommend you do it twice for the titanium alloy. Now, we're not going to be copy pasting similar builds the entire episode, more or less what we did last time. We're actually going to do a lot more interesting stuff, but this is the most efficient way to get this going. Now, you'll probably notice that this isn't working anywhere close to optimal efficiency, mainly because all the previous steps are yet to be optimized. But that's okay, just make sure you get some of these particle containers and some of this alloy, and that's already more than enough for what we need right now. And having access to these two new resources means we can expand our mall a little bit, so we have a planetary logistics assembler over here making those, and then we have the interstellar version being crafted over here with two assemblers. That's just a personal preference because you actually use those, or at least I use those a lot more than I use the planetary version, and I just want to make sure this is replenishing as fast as I can get. Right now it's not going fast at all, but again, that will fix itself in the near future. We just need to make sure we're ready for it. Now, of course, this mall is nice and all, but it's not actually going to supply us with any buildings on a different planet. So in order to fix that, we are going to make a polar mall. And specifically, we're going to make one that is going to supply other malls with that. And then we're going to build the actual mall that we're going to put on other planets where we will be supplied with other buildings. And the best place to do those things are usually on poles, like I just said, and for several reasons actually. One, because it's a very nice looking type of layout, so that's one of the best reasons to actually do that. But the second reason is that, similar to what we've done over here, you typically want to make your larger builds near the equator, and basically that means that the mall is going to be out of the way of all the larger builds that you're going to be doing. So on one of the poles will work just fine. Now, rather than me going, poof, here's a mall, let me show you how you design this. So look for those straight, thick lines that go through the poles. These will actually go all the way around the planet uninterrupted, just for convenience sake, so you know where you're building. And then don't look for the first ring, not the second ring, not the fourth ring, not the fifth ring, but actually the sixth one. And then take it 2 steps on the outside, and then on the other side do the exact same thing. So 1, 2 from the middle to the outside, and then if you follow that same line around the planet, you should see it turning blue round about here. And then you should be able to do the same thing over here. So as you can see, if I go 1 step to the left, nope, 1 step to the right, nope. It's actually left and right in the reverse, but you know what I mean. It will fit exactly for like this. Now you do that all around, and you will get something like this. Now actually you can put another ILS in the middle, which is exactly what I'm going to do. And then we are going to make sure these are being supplied with the buildings that we've been creating on this planet. Now the idea is really simple, just decide what goes in which ILS. As you can see, I have the things I need on every single planet in the middle one, just so I know where it is, as well as actually some proliferators that I'm requesting rather than sending out to the rest of the universe. So this will be my input for proliferators on this planet, or at least one of them. And put a logistics distributor near every corner of it and make sure that you're pulling those buildings in. So as you can see, I'm requesting this sorters, as well as bells, as well as power panel, solar panels, I mean, as well as power poles. And those will be flown in from our mall, and they will be put in the logistics station. Now make sure that you put these limits to something that's sensible. In terms of belts and sorters, you might want to put a very high limit, but when it comes to buildings like, for example, the ILS itself, set it to the minimum amount, because you're not going to need thousands of those in storage, especially since we already have a storage box on the planet. At the mall, we'll have a second storage box over here, so again, you want to set the limits to these as well. Again, just put them on a medium limit, just so that you already have some of them in storage, so they get replenished pretty quickly. But don't overdo it. You don't need storage on top of storage on top of storage. In terms of all the other ones, you will have more space in these ILSs than you have buildings, but that is because the blueprint is basically prepared on you adding more buildings as we progress through the game, so you can just use these open spaces and then make sure that you also update the other blueprints, and doing so will make sure you have all the buildings at the end of the game in your mall available for you anywhere in the galaxy. There's a couple of things to keep in mind though when you're doing this. So in terms of the layout, where you put the boxes as well as the distributors and stuff like that doesn't really matter. I would recommend leaving some space between the actual ILSs so that you can easily make a belt like this. At some point we'll actually want to include warpers in this layout, and the warpers will need to be able to move from one ILS to another, so this will just make sure that happens and you don't need to rebuild it. So keep it on the inside and outside is what I would recommend. Also, again, make sure you take note of the storage, but also inside. Make sure you limit the amount of buildings you have available. But also I would recommend kind of grouping them in a way that makes sense to you. So for example, what I've done over here in this specific ILS, these are all power related items. So it just makes it a little easier to find them again. Similarly, I have logistics related items over here, with the exception of this geothermal power station. What else do I have? For example, I have here, these are all basic production items as well as the storage. These are the kind of the intergalactic type of things. Now, as you can see, I left some open spaces. For example, I want to be able to use the orbital collectors in this same layout as well. And again, you will have a couple of ILSs left over where there's simply nothing in here. So you can use these for later stage buildings, or group the buildings differently in such a way that you might have only 3 or 4 in one without you losing the track of your own logic. There is another reason why I want to make sure I have plenty of room in my mall, and that is because of the upcoming combat update. Now, as I mentioned, this is before that update, and I am preparing basically all my builds to make sure I can use them during the update. But since we'll probably get new items and new buildings in there, I don't know how many, I don't know what those items and buildings will be, but I'm pretty sure we're going to have to be able to defend ourselves on different planets as well. So the mall should go a long way towards making sure that happens. Once you go around and set all the buildings up, you might as well add in some power, and if you have plenty of foundations waiting for you, then why not just give it a bit of a national theme as well. Of course, it's completely up to you whether or not you bother with foundations, but yeah, it just looks cool in my opinion. Now, there is a last thing I want to mention here, and that is that I intentionally left this white area alone because I want to be able to put in some more advanced power there later on, and it's a very convenient place to do so. So just a bit thinking ahead there, but for now this will function just fine. Now make sure you blueprint this so you don't ever have to go through making this all up again, or just copy my blueprint. It's completely up to you. Now, of course, that mall is mainly going to be useful if there's actually buildings inside that mall, so I added in all the little buildings that we have unlocked at this point in time. And as you can see, it's pretty much the same layout over and over. You don't really need any of these at this point in time, so don't worry if they're not actually being built. If they are, great. If they aren't, don't worry, because the main thing that you're looking for is the ones making the logistics drones and the logistics vessels. And again, this might actually not be producing anything, and there's a very good reason for that, because right now I have a bottleneck in steel and we're actually out of coal on this planet. So let's put our mall to use and go fix all of that. Now here we are back on our home planet, where our little factory, and it really looks tiny now, doesn't it? Anyway, it's still happily plugging along. It's still producing stuff. We actually have some ILSs waiting for us, some vessels. A lot of useful things are waiting for us here. There's a lot of oil produced, so we have that going for us as well. But what we really want to do is, well, improve upon this significantly. And in order to do that, we are going to need those buildings that we just produced on the other planet. And in order to get those here, we are going to need a receiving mall. And in order to build that, you can actually use the same blueprint that you used to build the original mall on the other planet. Now, let's find a pole. We have coal over here, so I don't really want to settle on this pole because this is actually the only planet we have a significant amount of coal. So let's make sure we use the most out of that. But there's only really stone over here on this other side. I already paved it a little bit in advance. So yeah, let's go build a mall over here. Now, you don't have to manually redo everything that you did for the previous mall. You can actually use the blueprint, like I just said. And in order to kind of tweak this blueprint in such a way that you can have an actual receiving mall blueprint going forward, all you need to do is swap whichever buildings you know you're going to always want to remote demand rather than a remote supply. And on top of that, as you can see, we already have things coming in. Assuming that there's enough power. I already picked all the conveyor belts that were in storage, so that's why it's not supplying that. So as you can see, it's already working, but if you wanted to actually supply it to your Icarus as well, all you need to do is also make sure these distributors have something to distribute. Now, you can actually flip belts, as I will show you here, so you can flip these belts all around. So that saves you a lot of belt work, just a click of a button. Now the only annoying thing is that doesn't actually work with sorters, so you will actually have to remove those sorters manually and then put them back in. But other than that, that's literally the only thing you need to do. So just flip the belts around, put in some new sorters, and you are good to go. And of course, make sure you make another blueprint out of this, so you don't have to do this every time you visit a new planet, but on the next one you can just plop it down. One detail to pay attention when you're doing this is that you might need to manually set some of the outputs. If you made the blueprint while you were already supplying them all with certain buildings, like the distributor in this example, it will already come with that output set on the port. And as you can see, there's actually already distributors on the belt. But in this case, for example, over here we have the power stations that I wasn't actually making at the time, so it won't automatically output those. So I actually need to set it so it will be coming on the belt later on. And with our second mall set up, it's now time to start draining some planets of all their resources and make sure we have them available anywhere we want. And it's really easy to do that thanks to the mall that we now have available to us. Now, don't stress too much over actually tapping into every single node on the planet. Like I said, you can if you want. Don't get me wrong, there's no downside of doing that, other than it taking some time. But the main priority that you want to focus on is actually getting a little bit of everything going. Some oil, especially, and coal. Those are the two main things that you should not forget to at least tap into. But also add in some iron and copper if it happens to be nearby. You can all feed it into a single ILS, or maybe 2 or 3 of those around the planet. And just have the main lines going into that with the raw resource. We'll be doing the processing centrally, so just make sure you have access to the raw resources, and don't forget to actually put vessels in your stations so that you can transport them to wherever they need to go. In the next episode, we'll be focusing on actually upgrading our planet and making it look even more organized than it already is. But for now, one thing you might want to do is actually just upgrade the assemblers that you have in this mini factory over here, since it'll be running anyway and it's still producing our yellow science. It's actually the only thing that's producing yellow science for us, at least the base resources to get those, as well as some ILSs and things like that. So you might as well upgrade it and have it chugging along while you are off-world. Speaking of going off planet, you should now see a steady stream of all kinds of vessels with all kinds of resources flying from your home planet to your mall planet to supply it with all those raw resources. Now we have access to some more resources back on our mall planet. We're going to focus on making carbon nanotubes. It's a pretty straightforward recipe. It is once again made in a chemical facility, and we should have enough room above this little build to make those. And it's the same build as for the graphene, but the difference is that we have graphene coming in as well as some titanium, and we have the carbon nanotubes coming out. Which means we now have all the items we need to do some serious proliferation. And in order to do that, we are going to need Mark 1, Mark 2, and Mark 3 proliferators. And it's worth noting that the Mark 1 proliferators produce at a 0.5 seconds rate, so that's actually really fast. This one assembler is going to be producing 2 per second, which means that a single line of 15 Mark II assemblers is actually going to need a full belt of coal coming in, which is a lot. So initially that's going to be our main bottleneck, but anyway, we are going to set it up in such a way that we're going to optimize the production for a huge amount of coal available to us anyway. Now, the Mark 1 proliferators are going to need to run into the Mark 2 proliferators, because basically you upgrade them similar to belts and sorters, which actually means we're going to loop them back on themselves. And I'll just set up 3 lines of this and show you what I mean by that. And there we go, we have all the Mark 1 proliferators being produced over here. There's 3 lines of 15 assemblers. We are going to need a lot of coal, and honestly, this single ILS will not be able to keep up with that for now. You do upgrade the load of your vessels later on in the game, of course. You upgrade their speed, and we will have multiple ILSs sending coal to the station later on. So this is, again, not going to function at optimal capacity at first. I mean, 3,000 incoming might seem like a lot, but we are draining that by means of 3 full belts. So we're draining 90 per second as soon as this arrives. So that's, as you can see, it's going to be gone really quickly. On the bright side, we are producing a ton of Mark 1 proliferators, so now all we need to do is set this up for the Mark 3. You might be wondering, by the way, why there is a Mark 1 proliferator in here, and that's because this belt needs to go through and I didn't want to go around. This is a really easy way to do this, and actually it serves as kind of a buffer for the Mark 1 proliferators as well. Just don't set this to 10,000 because you really do not want 10,000 of these in storage. There's another thing to note is because we are setting all of this on a single belt, or at least I want to keep it clean, and that's why I'm doing that, we need some stackers in between. I guess these are technically called pilers, but it's an annoying word. So we have these stackers in between, and just to stack them up to either a size of 2, a size of 3, or a size of 4. It will vary a little bit depending on which belt it's drawn from, but that's actually enough to make sure we have this on a optimal throughput. As you can see, we have 2 stacks, 3 stacks, etc. going on already. Now, all we need to do is add in 2 more lines of Mark II and Mark III proliferators on top of this, and we have something going that's going to be awesome. For the Mark II proliferation, all we need is some diamonds along with the Mark I proliferators. So all you need to do is copy one of these lines up here, copy it down here, change, of course, the labels if you are using those labels, and add in a different belt for the diamonds. Of course, you need a lot of diamonds, so I'm bringing them in by the distributors. I added in 2 belts, 2 logistic distributors for each belt, I should say, so 4 in total. You can actually double up on this if you want. You can also do this with the planetary logistics if that's what you prefer. I don't think it's needed, but yeah, it's completely up to you. Of course, as you can see, we already produced quite a bit of that because we have all the materials coming in. So now all we need to do is copy this again and do it the same for the Mark III proliferators. So there you go, we are now producing Mark III proliferators, and this splitter is here to make sure we actually make the most out of our spray painters. Now, I put them on the belts, on all the inputs, and this is one of the most satisfying things to do in the game, is build it through all the inputs at once, and that's the reason that you want to do it in one go. It's a lot more convenient than doing it one by one. And that means we are now starting to proliferate our proliferators. And you always want to proliferate your proliferators because you get a lot more uses out of them. So I pre-prepared some in this box over here, I believe. Let me, assuming I can actually click it. There we go. So we have some unproliferated proliferators in here that normally give you 60 sprays. And if we proliferate them completely, we get a total of 75 sprays. So by spraying a proliferator once, you get 14 free sprays back. Or 15, but one of them is going to cancel out the one that you used. So this is a huge amount extra, and well, proliferating is always worth it, but it's definitely worth proliferating your proliferators for that reason. I also recommend just using the 25% extra products. That's the default setting on the machines for a reason, I believe. And the simple reason for that is that means we are making the same stuff with a lot less inputs required. And you can do this at every stage, so you can actually reduce the amount of raw materials that you need to put in by a huge amount if you do this for every step along the way. And all my builds have been set up so far, keeping that in mind. This means we can now start proliferating everything else, and I suggest you work your way backwards from the more expensive materials back to the basics. In some cases, like this build over here, you need to kind of zigzag around in order to reach all the belts. But in most places, I set it up in such a way that you can just do a single belt and it should reach everything with a clean single line. Now, I also think you should be proliferating the more basic stuff, including just the simple ores to make materials. Now, some people prefer using the speed setting, but there's a couple of reasons why I don't think that's the optimal setting. Mostly because you're going to need a lot more inputs, and we don't have those inputs at the moment. So actually having a belt that has enough inputs to be able to handle all the raw resources that you're going to need on this belt is actually far from trivial this early in the game. And hey, free stuff is free stuff one way or another, so this is definitely the way to go. If you feel that certain items are getting bottlenecked, that's probably not an issue of having too few machines. It's likely an issue of having either too few inputs or having too few bots flying up and down. Now you can solve that with a PLS, for example, or belting straight through. I just like to keep things clean, and I just put in a few more of these distributors to make sure I kept up. Especially considering the magnetic rings are likely one of your bottlenecks, you need to make sure these magnets and copper bars are getting in as fast as you can get them. However, your main issue is likely going to be raw resource. As you can see, I am completely depleted of silicon and iron ore in this ILS. And basically even though there's thousands of these coming in, the ships at this point are not fast enough to keep up. And as we keep upgrading them, they will start flying faster, they will be able to transport more. So this is a problem that will fix itself. But of course, there's an easier way to fix that in the meanwhile, which is going to your other planets and making sure you are basically supplying the other planets with enough raw resources. Just put up an ILS, make sure you have vessels in there, make sure you have enough power, and you're pretty much good to go. If you are lacking power, just putting some of these solar panels near the domes is a very easy way to make sure you have a decent amount of power. And if all you're doing here is just mining and sending that off, that should get you a very long way in terms of just raw power without having to go all around the planet with these solar panels. Now the time has come to just let your mall do its thing for a while we focus on a few other things and get all the buildings going in the meanwhile. And for that purpose, I also built the crystal silicon as well as the photon combiners over here, because we need them for several of the buildings we have now unlocked. We don't necessarily need those buildings, but we might as well start producing the base materials for them, just to make sure that we can keep that going while we are doing other things. Now you might be wondering why I spend so much time setting up this elaborate mall while not focusing on science. That is because we have had the science ticking in the background all the while, so you should probably have unlocked most, not all, but most at least of the basic yellow item stuff. And in the next episode, we are actually going to go focus on science in a major way. So just making sure that we get all the basics out of the way here means that while we're doing that, this will start building stuff, and then we can draw upon that, as well as the science after the next episode, and basically rush all the way to the end game very straightforward. That means one way or another you're going to have to invest time in building everything up, and this is one of the ways you can do it. It's definitely not the only way, but I think it's quite fun with all the little drones flying all over the place. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Make sure you join me next time for a massive research jump, and for now I hope to catch you in the next one.